They tried to erase her name from history. A teenage queen, barely 17, trapped in a foreign palace of ice and whispers. Her only crime? Falling in love, not with power, not with riches, but with the one man forbidden to her by every law of crown and God. You've heard the stories of kings gone mad, but few know about the young English princess who married one, a king whose sanity slipped like glass through his fingers, and the secret that would set an entire nation on fire. In the candlelit corridors of Copenhagen, she was supposed to be silent, obedient, invisible. Instead, she became a revolution. And the man she loved, a doctor, a commoner, became the most dangerous figure in Europe. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a confession buried under centuries of royal scandal, betrayal, and blood. They said she smiled too icily for a queen, that her laughter, bright and careless, echoed through the marble halls like a melody from another world. Caroline, Matilda of Great Britain, had been born into duty, the youngest sister of King George III. But her heart still belonged to the meadows of England, to the scent of rain on grass, to the sound of her own unguarded laughter. At 15, she was told she would marry the King of Denmark. It was not a request. The letter came sealed with red wax, the royal crest pressed deep into it like a mark of destiny. Her governess read it aloud as she sat in her embroidery chair, hands trembling, a knot forming in her chest. Christian VII, 20 years old, unpredictable, handsome by reputation, and unstable by whispered truth. Even in the glittering circles of London, rumours bled across borders, his nights spent in wild excess, his moods shifting like wind across the sea. But England needed Denmark. Politics demanded sacrifice, and she, still a child, was the offering. When the ship left Dover, the waves crashed hard against the hull, and the cold air burned her lungs. She watched the coast fade behind her and tried not to cry. Her lady-in-waiting whispered that Denmark would be a fresh start, that queens grow into their crowns. But Caroline felt only the slow closing of a door. The Danish court was a cage wrapped in silk. The king's palace at Christiansborg glimmered with chandeliers, each crystal reflecting 1,000 tiny lies. Courtiers bowed low, smiles sharp as blades. They whispered about the English girl, her accent, her clothes, her youth. And when the king appeared for the first time, Caroline's breath caught, not because of beauty, but because of something far more dangerous, unpredictability. Christian VII's eyes were bright and feverish, his grin too wide to knowing. He greeted her with extravagant courtesy, kissed her hand, then turned abruptly to make a crude joke to his valet. Laughter erupted from his companions, a hollow sound that made Caroline's skin crawl. Their wedding was a spectacle, carriages gilded in gold, trumpets echoing across Copenhagen, a sea of faces watching her every move. She wore pearls so heavy they dug into her skin, and when she said her vows, she wondered if the words would mean anything in a language she barely understood. That night, as the celebrations stretched into the early hours, she sat by the window of her new chamber, the candle burning low. The king had already gone to drink and dance again. Outside, the city glimmered under the snow, and she whispered to herself, "I am a queen now," as if saying it aloud might make it true. Days became weeks, and the cold grew deeper. Christian's behavior worsened, erratic, cruel, and frightening. He laughed at her innocence, mocked her English manners, and vanished for days on end into taverns and brothels. The courtiers said nothing. No one dared confront a king, not even when his madness began to spill into the corridors. Caroline's only solace was her son, born in the 2nd year of her marriage. She named him Frederick, and when she held him, she felt warmth again, a reason to survive the frozen halls. But even that joy was shadowed by the king's neglect. He called the child a royal mistake, paraded him before guests as if he were a toy. The court began to whisper again. The queen was lonely. The queen was unwanted. The queen was dangerous. And then, one day, he arrived, Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician, summoned from Altona to care for the king's nervous condition. He was tall, calm, with a sharpness in his eyes that seemed to see through the lies of the court. When he entered the room, Christian laughed and called him my new magician. But it was Caroline who felt something shift, a spark of something she hadn't felt since she'd left. England, curiosity. Struensee treated the king with a gentleness no one else dared. He spoke to him as an equal, challenged him with wit, drew him out of his fits with patience and reason. Slowly, Christian began to depend on him, and through that dependence, Struensee found himself at the heart of power. For Caroline, it began innocently. A conversation about books, a shared concern for the people outside the palace walls. Then a glance, a touch when passing papers across a desk, the smallest of smiles held too long. The palace walls might have been marble, but inside they began to burn. She found reasons to see him, to discuss reforms, to talk about medicine, to ask about the king. But each time, their words slid further from politics into something forbidden. She told him of England, of her longing to walk freely, of her fear of becoming invisible. He listened, and for the first time, she felt seen. Their love, if it could be called that yet, was born in shadows. They would pass each other in corridors, their hands brushing lightly, their eyes saying everything their lips could not. The world around them, blind and deaf to their secret, continued to spin, but the danger grew with every heartbeat. For Struensee, it was not just love. It was awakening. He began to see the corruption of the court, the poverty of the people, the hypocrisy of the nobles. With Caroline's encouragement, he began drafting reforms, laws that would change Denmark forever. And through it all, the king smiled, oblivious, calling Struensee his dearest friend. But friendship is a fragile veil, and love, once discovered in the wrong place, can destroy everything it touches. The first letter between them was written in trembling ink. She wrote it at night, in candlelight, sealing it with her signet and pressing it into his hand beneath a stack of royal decrees. "You make me feel human," it said. He read it in silence, his heart pounding, and whispered, "And you make me brave." That was the night their fate was sealed. The snow outside Christiansborg Palace had turned to ice, and the wind cut across Copenhagen like a knife. Inside the palace walls, the fires burned high, but the warmth felt false. A desperate attempt to hide the growing chill between the king and queen. Struensee's presence had changed everything. The courtiers noticed it first, the way the queen's gaze lingered too long when the physician entered the room, the quiet laughter they shared in private corridors, the way the king deferred to his doctor on matters he barely understood. In the eyes of the court, lines were blurring. And where there are blurred lines in royal halls, there is blood soon to follow. Yet within that fragile tension, Caroline felt alive. She had begun to see the world through Struensee's eyes, the world outside the gilded walls. He spoke of farmers starving under unjust taxes, of soldiers paid in promises, of children dying in the streets while the nobles dined on gold plates. He talked of new ideas spreading across Europe: liberty, equality, reason. Words that frightened kings and inspired men. She had never heard anyone speak that way before. He would come to her chambers under the pretext of discussing the king's health. The guards would step aside, their eyes avoiding hers. Behind the closed doors, words turned to whispers, and whispers turned to touches. The first time he kissed her, it was not out of passion but desperation. Two souls exiled in the same gilded cage. That kiss burned through every rule written in ink or blood. After that night, they lived in constant fear, and yet they could not stop. Letters passed in hidden books, secret meetings in gardens shrouded with frost. Each glance carried the weight of everything they could lose: her crown, his life, their souls. But the danger only deepened their bond. One morning, Struensee found himself summoned to the council chamber. The king had been raving again, pacing and laughing at shadows. When Struensee entered, Christian froze, then broke into a wide, childlike smile. "My magician," the king cried, "come, help me rid the air of demons." The courtiers watched in silence as Struensee approached, calm and composed. He took the king's hand, whispered softly, and within minutes the manic laughter ebbed away. The room held its breath. When Christian turned to sit, the nobles exchanged glances, not admiration, but fear, for in that moment they saw the shift of power. The king trusted his physician more than any minister, any noble, any family. And through that trust, Struensee began to reshape Denmark. The first reforms seemed harmless. He advised the king to improve sanitation in the city, to fund hospitals, to educate midwives. The people cheered. The queen supported him openly, claiming the changes reflected the will of a kind and compassionate monarch. But soon the reforms went further. Nobles lost their privileges. Censorship was eased. The press began to speak freely for the first time in living memory. And behind every decree, every law, every royal decision was the invisible hand of Johann Friedrich, Struensee. At night, in the Queen's chambers, they would lie awake and whisper of the future. "What if we could change everything?" Caroline would murmur, tracing the edge of his hand. "And we will," he'd whisper back. "For your son, for the people, for us." She smiled then, believing it, believing that love could be both salvation and revolution. But the court was watching. Count Ranso, a man of old power and older grudges, began to stir the nobles into whispers of treason. "The German controls the king," he would say over wine, "and the queen, God forgive her, is his accomplice." They began to gather evidence, servants bribed, notes intercepted, shadows following every step. The palace became a theatre of deception. Each dinner, each ball, each passing glance carried the weight of danger. Caroline learned to wear masks, smiling when her heart raced, laughing while fear clawed at her ribs. Struensee too changed. Power, once a means to an end, began to consume him. He stayed up through the night writing decrees, drafting laws, commanding ministers. His words now carried royal authority, every order signed by the king's trembling hand, and yet, in the quiet between dawn and daylight, he was still the man who held her hand, who whispered that everything they risked was worth it, until the night of the masquerade. It was held in honor of the king's improved condition. Candles filled the great ballroom, mirrors reflecting 1,000 masked faces. Caroline wore a gown of deep crimson, her mask trimmed with gold. Struensee watched from across the room, his eyes meeting hers only once, a brief glance that felt like a promise and a warning all at once. The king danced wildly, spinning from one partner to the next, his laughter high and unsteady. Nobles applauded, pretending not to see the madness beneath the jewels. But as the night grew late, Count Ranso made his move. He approached the king, his words dripping with venom disguised as loyalty. "Your Majesty," he said, "there are whispers that the physician grows too fond of your queen, that his hand reaches beyond your throne." The king froze. Ranso pressed further, leaning close. "Even now, look, they do not dance, but their eyes do. Every courtier sees it but you." Christian's laughter faltered. His face paled. His hand trembled. The seed had been planted. Later that night, in her chamber, Caroline stood by the fire, waiting. Struensee entered quietly, closing the door behind him. For the first time, he looked different, his usual calm shadowed by something darker. "They know," he said simply. Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "They're watching. Ranso, Goldberg, half the court. They've begun gathering signatures against me, against us." She stepped closer, her fingers trembling. "Then we must act. The king still trusts you. Use it." He nodded slowly, eyes heavy with the burden of their shared secret. "Yes, but love is no shield. And when kings fall, those who love them fall faster." Outside, the snow began again, soft, relentless, endless. Inside, two lovers stood in silence, knowing the storm had only begun. The next days were chaos masked as calm. Struensee moved quickly, consolidating his control. He dismissed hostile ministers, filled positions with loyal men, accelerated reforms. He even convinced the king to grant him the title of Privy Cabinet Minister, effectively making him the ruler of Denmark. To the public, he was a hero. Pamphlets praised his wisdom. The poor hailed him as the people's voice. The queen appeared beside him in portraits, serene and untouchable, the image of enlightened monarchy. But within the palace, daggers gleamed behind smiles. The nobles whispered of witchcraft, of seduction, of a queen who had bewitched both king and doctor. The church thundered that sin ruled the throne, and somewhere, deep inside his gilded loneliness, the king began to break again. He would wander the halls at night, muttering, tearing at his clothes, calling out for his little English bird. But when she appeared, his eyes would fill with terror, as if seeing a ghost. It was Ranso who found him one such night, alone, trembling, muttering of betrayal. He poured the poison of words gently, like a priest administering last rites. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "they plot to take your throne. Your queen and your doctor. They plan to make you a prisoner." The king, lost in confusion, believed him, and so the trap was set. One by one, the queen's allies were isolated, messages intercepted, servants turned. The walls that once hid their love now echoed with suspicion. Still, Caroline refused to break. "We have come too far," she told Struensee. "They cannot undo what we've done. The people will not allow it." He smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed fear. "History is not written by the people, my love. It is written by survivors." The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept across Copenhagen, a messenger rode from the palace, carrying sealed orders to arrest the enemies of the king. What no one knew was that by nightfall, those same orders would be turned against the man who wrote them. The revolution they had birthed together was about to devour its creators. Dawn crept over Copenhagen like a hesitant confession, pale and cold. The palace stood still under a thin veil of mist, its towers catching the first light as though reluctant to wake. Inside, the corridors were hushed, tense as if the marble itself knew that something was about to break. Caroline, Matilda awoke to silence. No footsteps in the hall, no laughter from the servants. Even the fire in her chamber had burned low, the coals faintly red beneath the ash. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped to the window. Outside, soldiers were assembling in the courtyard, not in parade formation, not in celebration, but in readiness. Something was wrong. A knock came at her door, soft, hesitant. Her lady-in-waiting entered, pale as the linen she clutched in her hands. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "there are rumors. Count Ranso has returned from Jutland. He met with General Goldberg at dawn." Caroline's heart quickened. She turned sharply. "Where is Struensee?" "In the council chamber, I believe. The king summoned him an hour ago." The words fell like stones. She didn't wait for permission. She walked quickly through the corridor, her steps echoing off the marble. Each turn revealed more soldiers, more watchful eyes. When she reached the council doors, 2 guards crossed their halberds to block her way. "The king has ordered no entry," one said flatly. She met his gaze, steady, regal. "I am the queen," she said. "You will stand aside." The hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was enough for fear to slip into her chest. When she pushed the door open, the sight inside froze her. Struensee stood before the throne, his hands bound behind him with silk cord. The king sat slumped, eyes glassy, mouth twitching in a nervous smile. Around them, the nobles watched in silence, vultures dressed in velvet. "Your Majesty," Caroline breathed, stepping forward. "What is this?" Christian looked at her, confusion flickering behind his eyes. "They say he is a traitor," he murmured, "that he seeks to rule in my name. Is it true, my queen?" Ranso stepped forward, bowing low. "The doctor has overstepped his station, sire. He has deceived you, and may God forgive us, deceived Her Majesty as well." The room went cold. Every word was a blade. Caroline's voice trembled but did not break. "Lies, every one of them. You know what he has done for you, for Denmark. You owe him your sanity." Ranso's smile was thin. "The sanity he gave you, Majesty, was his leash upon you both." Struensee turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers. "Don't speak," he whispered. "They've already decided." Guards moved forward. In that moment, Caroline's mind split between 2 truths, the queen and the woman. The queen wanted to command, to stop them. The woman wanted only to run to him, to tear the cords away. But she could do neither. They dragged him from the room. His eyes never left hers until the doors slammed shut, and the echo of that sound felt like the end of the world. By evening, the palace was locked down. Ministers loyal to Struensee were imprisoned or fled. His papers were seized. His reforms halted. Outside, the people whispered in confusion. The man they had hailed as savior was now branded traitor. Caroline was confined to her chambers for her protection, they said, but she knew it was a cage. The guards outside her door were not there to keep her safe. They were there to ensure she didn't speak, didn't plead, didn't escape. For 2 days she heard nothing. Then, on the 3rd night, a priest arrived, sent not for her soul, but for her silence. He spoke in riddles of repentance and shame. urging her to confess her worldly attachments. When she asked where Struensee was held, he only murmured, "In the citadel." Under guard, that night, she did not sleep. She wrote instead a letter, short and trembling. "My dearest heart, if this reaches you, know that I did not break. They may take the crown, they may take the child, but they cannot unmake what we were. I will find a way. Hold faith until the dawn." She folded it into a page torn from her prayer book, sealed it with a strand of her hair, and handed it to her maid. "Give this to the guard at the kitchen gate. Tell him it's from the Queen's confessor. He will deliver it." Whether it ever reached him, history never tells. Struensee's imprisonment became the talk of Copenhagen. They called it justice, though no trial had yet been held. The court whispered that he had bewitched the king, that he had plotted to dethrone him and crown the queen. Every rumor was a spark, and soon the whole city was aflame with gossip and hatred. When the trial finally began, it was less a hearing than a public execution of reputation. Struensee, thin and pale from confinement, was brought before a council of nobles who already knew their verdict. His voice was calm, his answers measured. "Did you dictate royal decrees in the king's name?" "I did, with his majesty's consent." "Did you influence her majesty beyond the boundaries of propriety?" He paused just long enough for silence to fill the chamber. "I served the queen with loyalty and respect." The judge smirked. "An affection?" Struensee looked up, his eyes steady. "Affection is not a crime, my lord." The room erupted in whispers. Caroline was not allowed to attend, but reports reached her through servants who risked their lives to tell her. Each word carved deeper into her heart. When she learned that Struensee had refused to implicate her, had taken every accusation upon himself, she wept for the first time in years. The verdict was inevitable: treason, sedition, adultery with the queen, the punishment, death by beheading, followed by quartering. When the sentence was read aloud, the court applauded, and still she was not allowed to see him. Days passed. Snow turned to rain, and the city sank into mud and mourning. On the morning of April 28, 1772, Struensee was led to the scaffold. Thousands gathered, their faces grey in the dawn. The queen remained locked in her chamber, guarded by soldiers who dared not meet her eyes. At the citadel, Struensee looked calm. He refused the blindfold. His last words were whispered to the pastor beside him. No one heard them, but the pastor later swore they were. "Tell her I was never afraid." When the blade fell, a single cheer rose from the crowd. Then silence. Caroline heard the bells toll from across the palace. She knew before anyone told her. She pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Then I will not fear either." That night, she burned every letter they had written, not out of shame, but to keep their story from the hands that would twist it. The smoke rose through the window, curling into the cold Danish air like the last ghost of a forbidden dream. 2 days later, the council declared her unfit to remain queen. She was stripped of her title, her jewels, her dignity. Her son, her beloved Frederick, was taken from her arms. She was told she would be sent into exile for the good of the realm. As they led her through the corridors, she passed the portraits of kings and queens before her, faces carved into eternity, indifferent to her pain. She stopped only once at the end of the long gallery and looked back toward the great hall. Once she had walked there as a queen, laughing, alive, in love. Now she was a ghost. When the carriage door closed, she whispered a single prayer: Let him be remembered not as a traitor, but as a man who tried to heal a king and loved a queen. Outside, the road to exile stretched endless and grey, and behind her, Denmark, the country they had tried to save, returned to its old order, its old silence. But among the people, in the taverns and streets, another story began to spread, one of courage and passion, of a queen who defied a king and a man who dared to change the world for her. Love, after all, cannot be executed. The road to exile wound endlessly through the winter fog. Caroline Matilda sat inside the carriage, wrapped in a wool cloak that smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, the last trace of her chamber in Copenhagen. The horses' hooves struck the frozen ground with dull rhythm, each sound another mile between her and everything she had ever known. She was 21 years old, a widow without a grave, a queen without a country. They said she was being sent to Celle, a quiet town in northern Germany, where the ghosts of forgotten nobles whispered through the halls of empty palaces. It was not prison, they insisted, a place of reflection, the council had called it. But exile by any other name was still a coffin lined with silk. When the carriage reached the Danish border, she looked back one last time. The land that had once been her kingdom lay behind her like a dream half remembered, the towers of Copenhagen faint in the mist. Somewhere beyond them, her son slept, her child, her heart, the last piece of herself she would never see again. She did not cry. The tears had all burned away the night Struensee died. Celle Castle loomed over the river Orla, its walls pale and austere, surrounded by fields still dead from winter. The guards opened the gates, their faces unreadable. Inside, servants bowed, unsure whether to call her Your Majesty or Your Grace. She said nothing. She only walked through the echoing corridors and stopped before a tall window overlooking the gardens. The silence was unbearable. Days turned into a kind of limbo, quiet meals, hollow prayers, letters unanswered. She rose with the dawn, walked through the frost-stiff gardens, and stared at the horizon until her vision blurred. Sometimes she would hum softly to herself, the lullaby she used to sing to her son when he was still small enough to cradle Dot at night. She lit candles until her room glowed like a chapel. In that light, she would whisper to the air as if he could hear her. You were my reason, my rebellion, my ruin. The courtiers sent from England visited her occasionally, bringing polite smiles and news carefully edited to spare her. Her brother, King George III, had written once a letter of sympathy and warning. You must remember your dignity, dear sister, it read. The crown is merciful, but the world is not. She had torn it in half. It was in Celle that she began to write again, not letters this time, but journals. Stories of her days in Copenhagen, of the reforms, of the laughter, the danger, the forbidden warmth. She wrote as if recording a confession no one would ever read. Perhaps it was her way of keeping him alive, Struensee, the man who had turned a mad king's court into a heartbeat of revolution. Sometimes, when the rain fell hard against the windows, she could almost see him, standing in the doorway, smiling the way he did when he tried to hide worry. You must rest, he would whisper in memory. The world is cruel enough. You need not be cruel to yourself. She would close her eyes and whisper back, then stay just for tonight. But dawn always came, and the vision would fade. Months passed. Spring thawed the frost, the gardens bloomed again, and birds returned to the trees. The townsfolk began to speak of her, the young English queen who walked the gardens in morning black, who spoke to no one but the wind. Some pitied her. Others feared her, believing she was cursed. Yet among the servants whispers spread of her kindness. She treated them as equals, thanked them by name, and shared her food when supplies ran low. The chambermaids swore she could not sleep without the sound of music, so one of them would quietly play the harpsichord in the next room until she drifted off. But even kindness could not fill the silence of exile. One day, a letter arrived from Copenhagen. It bore the seal of her son's Regency Council. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words inside were formal, cold, written by men who had never known love nor loss. His Majesty King Christian VII, with the Council's approval, wishes Her Grace good health and peace. His Royal Highness Prince Frederick is flourishing under the care of his tutors and nurses. It is requested that correspondence cease, as His Majesty deems it inappropriate for the Prince's education. No signature from her child. Not even a word. That night, the candles in her chamber burned until dawn. Servants found her sitting by the window, the letter clutched in her hand, her expression calm to calm. She did not speak for 3 days after. Then, as if reborn through grief, she began to change. She ordered the neglected gardens restored, brought in local scholars to teach her German, and began visiting the village under guard. The people, wary at first, grew to love her. She donated to the poor, helped rebuild a church roof, and even tended to sick children herself. She smiles again, one villager said, but her eyes, they are still somewhere else, and they were, always. Behind every act of kindness, behind every new bloom she planted, there lived a shadow, the memory of a man who had once promised her a world remade in truth. In the evenings, she would sit by the riverbank, sketching in a small book. No one knew what she drew until a maid, curious, peeked once and saw page after page of his face, Struensee's eyes, his hands, the curve of his smile. She said nothing, only wept quietly in the hallway. The English envoys wrote home that she had found tranquility. They did not see that peace was simply another form of mourning. Then came the fever. It began as a chill in late spring of 1775. Caroline dismissed it at first, a simple cold, but within days it worsened. Her skin burned, her breath came shallow. The doctor from Hanover spoke in low tones about inflammation of the chest. Lying in bed, drenched in sweat, she asked for her journal. I must finish what I started, she murmured. Her hand trembled as she wrote, each line smaller, her ink thinning. If history remembers me, let it not be as queen or sinner. Let it remember that I loved, that I dared to love. When the fever peaked, she began to speak to shadows. She whispered Struensee's name, reached for his hand in the air, smiled as though she saw him waiting. The priest sat by her side, reciting prayers. She interrupted softly, no prayers, please. Only quiet. He will find me soon. And then, in the early hours of May 10th, 1775, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, the Queen who defied a crown, who dared to love in a world built on obedience, took her last breath. The candle beside her bed flickered once, then went out. She was 20-3. Word of her death reached Copenhagen within weeks. The court observed official mourning, though most did so out of duty rather than sorrow. The king, frail and haunted, asked one question when told, was she happy? No one answered. Her brother George ordered her body returned to Denmark, but the Danes refused. She belongs to history now, they said. And so she was buried in cell, in a quiet church near the garden she had restored, beneath a single stone that read simply, Caroline Matilda 175-11775, no titles, no crown, just a name, and beneath it, silence. Yet the story did not end there, in Copenhagen. Whispers began anew of a queen who had loved too fiercely, of a doctor who had tried to save a king and a country, of a child who would one day rule. Decades later, when her son, Frederick VI, ascended the throne, his first act was to overturn many of the laws that had condemned Struensee. It was said that on the day of his coronation, he ordered flowers sent to Celle, to the grave of a woman he had barely known but never forgotten. Time buried their names in dust, yet the echoes of their defiance lingered in the laws they dreamed, in the courage they shared, in the tragic truth that love, once kindled against the world, never truly dies. Some nights, the townsfolk of Celle still swear that when the mist rises from the river and the wind rustles through the ivy, a woman's voice can be heard humming softly, a lullaby for a child she lost, and a promise to a man who waits beyond the veil. The wind over Copenhagen that winter was cruel. It clawed through the narrow streets, rattled the shutters of the great palaces, and whispered through the iron bars of Kronborg Castle, where the young queen, Caroline Matilda, sat alone, waiting to be judged by the country she had tried to save. The same bells that had once rung for her wedding now tolled for her ruin. Inside her cell, the air was damp with salt and smoke. The sea crashed against the rocks below, as if mocking her. She had been stripped of her crown, her jewels, and her freedom. Only her wedding ring remained, a thin circle of gold she could not bear to remove. Every day, guards came to question her. Ministers demanded confessions, priests demanded repentance. But the queen said little. She had learned that, in a palace of spies, silence was the last form of dignity. A month earlier, the coup had come like thunder. January 1772, in the dead of night, soldiers surrounded Christiansborg Palace. Boots echoed on marble floors. Servants were dragged from their beds, papers seized, letters burned. When the soldiers broke into Struensee's chambers, they found him asleep, a candle still burning beside a half-written decree. The captain read aloud the warrant for crimes against the crown, the church, and the state. Struensee rose slowly. "Then it begins," he whispered. At the same moment, in another wing of the palace, the queen's door burst open. She woke to the sound of shouting, hands gripping her arms, the glint of bayonets in the firelight. By order of the council, the officer barked. "Her Majesty is to be placed under arrest. For what crime?" She demanded, voice trembling. "Love," he said, without irony. They took her son, little Prince Frederick, from her arms before dawn. He was 4 years old. The boy screamed for his mother as they carried him down the corridor. Caroline's cries followed him until they reached the courtyard, where the soldiers drowned her voice in the clatter of hooves and wheels. Later, she would tell her guard, "That sound of the carriage rolling away, it has never stopped inside my head." Struensee was imprisoned in Castellet Fortress, a cold, star-shaped citadel that reeked of damp stone and despair. There, under the flickering light of oil lamps, the interrogations began. They asked him to renounce the queen, to claim their love had been sin, not truth. He refused. They beat him until he could no longer stand. They showed him forged letters, fake testimonies. Even a miniature portrait they claimed had been found beneath her pillow. Finally, exhausted, He signed the confession, a single page written in a shaking hand. "I loved her," it read, "and for that I die content." The trial that followed was no trial at all. It was theatre, the kind designed to satisfy both mob and monarchy. The court, draped in velvet and hypocrisy, accused them of adultery, treason, and heresy. Caroline was not permitted to attend. She was judged in absentia, condemned in silence. Witnesses, bribed and terrified, testified that they had seen her walking hand in hand with the doctor in the royal gardens. A chambermaid swore she heard laughter behind closed doors. A priest declared that the Queen's sin has blackened the throne itself. By the end of February, the verdict was sealed. Struensee was to be executed. The Queen was to be divorced, exiled, and erased. The morning of the execution was clear and cold. They led Struensee through the streets in chains. His white shirt open at the throat, his eyes lifted toward the sky. Crowds lined the road, some jeering, some weeping. He stopped once when he saw the spire of Christiansborg in the distance. He whispered something that the guards could not hear. Later, a witness swore he had said, "I die for love, and for a queen who was worth a kingdom." At the scaffold, he refused the blindfold. When the blade fell, the city fell silent. Even the executioner, hardened by years of blood, crossed himself. When news reached Kronborg, Caroline Matilda did not cry. She stood at the window, watching the grey horizon where sea met sky. "Then it is done," she said. "They have killed Denmark's only honest man." That night she burned his letters, not from shame, but to keep them from her enemies. The ashes scattered through the draught, rising like dark butterflies. Only one piece she kept, a line written in Struensee's hand: "If I die, remember that freedom was not a dream, but a beginning." She folded it into her bodice and never let it leave her again in Copenhagen. The purge began. The ministers who had plotted the coup reclaimed their positions. Reforms were reversed. Censorship returned. The printing presses that had once sung with liberty now groaned with decrees. Everything Struensee had built, every law of mercy, every act of enlightenment was erased with ink and fear. The people who had once cheered the Queen now spat her name. Pamphlets called her the English whore. Priests denounced her from pulpits. Her brother, King George III, sent envoys demanding her release, not out of affection, but embarrassment. "England will not see a daughter of its crown rot in a dungeon," his letter read. Under diplomatic pressure, Denmark finally agreed. Caroline Matilda would be freed. But freedom came with a cost. She would never see her son again. On a grey spring morning in 1772, a small ship waited in the harbour. The Queen was escorted aboard by soldiers who avoided her eyes. She wore mourning black, her face pale as frost. As the ship pulled away, the towers of Copenhagen blurred behind her in mist. Somewhere among them, her child slept, dreaming of a mother he would soon forget. She stood at the rail until the city vanished, whispering the same words over and over, "I forgive you." Exile brought her to Celle. In northern Germany, a quiet town surrounded by forests and fog. The Danish court called it mercy. To her, it was a living grave. She lived in a modest house, far from politics and rumour. There were no guards now, only silence. She walked the gardens at dawn, tended roses in the afternoon, and wrote letters she never sent. She was 23 years old, and already the world spoke of her in the past tense. But history, as always, refuses to stay buried. Visitors came, diplomats, poets, even spies. Some sought gossip. Others sought redemption. They found a woman transformed, no longer the reckless girl who had defied a king, but a quiet figure with eyes that saw too much. She read Voltaire by candlelight, kept a portrait of her son by her bed, and refused to speak of Struensee except to say he believed in light. They feared the dawn. Sometimes, at night, the servants heard her playing the harpsichord, soft, sorrowful melodies drifting through the house. Once, a maid swore she saw the queen whisper to an empty chair, as though someone still sat beside her. "Do not be afraid," she said. "We did not fail. We only began too soon." In 1775, a fever swept through Celle. Caroline Matilda fell ill. The doctors came too late. On the morning of May 10th, she asked for her ring, the one she had refused to remove. When it was placed in her hand, she smiled faintly. "Tell my son," she whispered, "that his mother loved freedom more than life. She died before sunrise." She was 20-3 back in Denmark. No bells tolled for her. No courtiers wore black. But years later, her son, now King Frederick VI, ordered that her portrait be restored in the royal gallery. He said only, "Let her look upon us again." And so, after decades of silence, the Queen's eyes returned to the walls of the palace she had once walked, eyes that had seen love, madness, and the death of a dream, eyes that refused to close. If you were standing in that quiet room in Celle, beside the dying Queen, and she asked you whether it had been worth it to risk everything for one forbidden love, what would you say? Would you tell her yes, because freedom and love are worth the crown? Or no, because the world is never kind to those who dare both? Because that is the cruel truth of Caroline Matilda's story. She changed a kingdom, and it destroyed her. But in the echo of her defiance, in every fight for liberty that came after, her heart still beats. The years that followed Caroline Matilda's death unspooled like a slow-fading echo across Europe. Her name had been whispered, condemned, and finally buried beneath polite silence, yet silence never holds forever. In the drawing rooms of London, in the coffee houses of Paris, in the academies of Berlin, her story drifted back to life, half scandal, half legend. Always haunting. They said she had died of fever, but the poets insisted she had died of a broken heart. In an age when kings ruled by divine right and women were bound by duty, her defiance lingered like perfume, faint, rebellious. Unforgettable. Copenhagen changed first. The winter after her death, rumors stirred of strange lights near the citadel, as though candles were burning in the chamber where Struensee had awaited execution. The soldiers who patrolled the walls claimed to hear a woman's voice humming through the fog, and one swore he saw a figure in white walking toward the scaffold. The captain dismissed it as drunken fancy, yet he too crossed himself each night before sleep at court. No one dared speak her name aloud, but her absence filled every corridor. The king aged quickly, slipping further into madness, his laughter echoing through empty halls. Sometimes he would call out for his little English bird, the same words he had once used to taunt her. His attendants would bow their heads and pretend not to hear. Across the North Sea, in England, public opinion began to shift. Pamphleteers questioned the fairness of her trial. Philosophers compared her tragedy to the tales of Antigone and Heloise. One anonymous essay, widely believed to have been written by a member of Parliament, declared, "If virtue lies in obedience alone, then tyranny shall always wear a crown." It was burned publicly in Copenhagen, but not before copies had spread through half of Europe. Time, as it always does, began to transform guilt into myth. Caroline became a symbol of love-defying power, of conscience against corruption. Painters captured her in candlelight, gazing toward a window she could never open. Playwrights turned her into a heroine undone by destiny, even in distant Paris, where revolutions brewed. Her name was invoked as a warning. See what happens when truth challenges the throne. But history, like the tide, always returns to the shore it once left behind. In 1808, her son, Frederick VI, became King of Denmark. He was 39, intelligent, tempered by caution, yet carrying within him the quiet fire of a memory he could not fully name. The day of his coronation, he wore a small ring hidden beneath his glove, a simple band of gold inscribed with 3 letters, CMS, Caroline Matilda Struensee. It had been found years earlier among her possessions in Celle, sent to him in secret by an English envoy who had once served her household. Frederick ruled differently. He reopened schools, eased the burden on peasants, encouraged learning and science, echoes of the reforms his mother and Struensee had dreamed together. He restored the freedom of the press, built hospitals, and spoke often of governing for the happiness of the people. When questioned by his ministers, he merely said, "It is what my mother would have wished." He never publicly mentioned her trial or her lover's execution, but his policies spoke for him. In his private study, he kept a portrait of her, not as queen, but as a young woman laughing in an English garden. Visitors who saw it noted the softness in his expression when he looked at it, as though trying to remember a lullaby from infancy. Meanwhile, Europe burned. Napoleon's armies marched, kingdoms fell, empires redrew themselves in smoke and steel. Denmark, too, suffered, its fleet destroyed, its cities bombed. And yet, through those years of turmoil, Frederick held fast to the idea that compassion was not weakness. He told his ministers once, "My mother died for love. Perhaps love is the only thing worth dying for." As decades passed, the legend of Caroline Matilda grew gentler. Children learned her story not as treason, but as tragedy. Old soldiers who had once guarded her spoke of her grace in exile. Travelers visiting Celle would lay flowers at her grave, wild daisies, roses, bits of folded poetry left beneath the stone that bore no title. The villagers tended her resting place as though she were one of their own. In 1840, a young historian uncovered letters long hidden in a Danish archive, fragments of Struensee's notes, and one unsigned page believed to be hers. It read simply, "To love in defiance of fear is to be free, even in chains." That single line reignited fascination. Scholars debated it, poets set it to verse. And soon the Queen, once erased from memory, became a muse for an entire generation yearning for freedom. Romantics painted her as the patron saint of impossible love. Reformers hailed her as a martyr of enlightenment. Yet for all the words written in her name, no one could capture the real heartbeat that had existed between her and Struensee, the quiet courage of 2 souls who found each other in a world built to keep them apart. In the middle of the 19th century, Frederick's daughter, Princess Caroline, visited Celle. She was the first Danish royal to do so since her grandmother's death. She laid a wreath of white lilies at the grave and whispered, "We remember." Those words, simple and unrecorded, marked the final reconciliation between a crown and its lost queen by the turn of the 20th century. History books described Caroline Matilda not as scandal, but as a turning point, the moment when Denmark began its slow, painful awakening from feudal darkness. Students studied Struensee's reforms as the foundation of modern Danish governance. His ideas on education, welfare, and civil rights, once condemned, had become law, and behind those reforms stood the shadow of the young queen who had believed in them. The 1900s brought new storytellers. Playwrights revived her tale with modern sympathy. A silent film in 1923 portrayed her as a tragic heroine. An opera followed, its aria of farewell said to bring audiences to tears. Each retelling softened the edges, but the heart remained the same. A girl who loved too fiercely, and a world that punished her for it. Even now, centuries later, her name carries a strange tenderness. Visitors to Celle often speak of feeling watched in the castle gardens, as if someone still walks there at dusk. On certain evenings, when the mist rises from the river, the faint melody of an old English lullaby drifts through the trees. Locals smile and say, "The Queen is singing to her son." What remains of her is more than history. It is the quiet rebellion that lives wherever love and courage meet. She was born into duty and died in defiance, yet her defiance changed a nation. Through her suffering, Denmark learned compassion. Through her loss, her son learned mercy. If you listen closely to the pages of time, you can still hear her voice, soft, unyielding, eternally young, whispering that freedom is not given by crowns, but by the heart that dares to beat against them, and somewhere beyond the reach of kings and councils, in that timeless place where all forbidden lovers meet again, Caroline Matilda walks once more beside Johann Friedrich Struensee. No guards, no chains, no judgment, only the endless dawn of the life they were denied. He takes her hand, and she smiles, the way she once did in an English meadow, before the world remembered her name.